Let's just start with the basics. So, in your view, what's a realistic sort of Sunday night conclusion from this weekend's festivities?
I think the baseline expectation is straightforward. The U.S. will agree not to go forward with a final round of $300 billion in tariffs. China will agree to resume talks, even if, I assume, the U.S. doesn't roll back some of the measures that have been introduced over the last 6 weeks. Presumably, there will be some goodwill gestures like the purchases of soybeans that were announced today. But the baseline is that talks will resume.
So we kind of know what the U.S. wants, or at least we think we know what the U.S. wants. What does China want out of this?
I think China wants, in the short run, it wants talks to resume without a loss of face. And then it wants a conclusion to the talks.
A loss of face?
Without a loss of face.
Oh, okay. And you think the U.S. is going to give that to them?
Well, I mean, that was why she more or less insisted that President Trump commit ahead of the meeting that he isn't going to raise tariffs.
I see.
All right, you know, China wasn't going to meet the president and then have the president go off and say, oh, forget about, tariffs are back on. China wanted a commitment from the U.S. that indicated that there would be at least a short-term truce. China wants the U.S. to roll back the tariffs. It wants the U.S. to lift the designation on Huawei, and it wants, in some sense, a return to the pre-tariff status quo. It might like a few other things. It might like more access to the U.S. market for Chinese investment, but I think the baseline goals of China are to return to the previous pattern of trade.
The Huawei element of this, do you think that that could be in the offing to be given by Trump himself? I mean, we saw him dial it back with ZTE or ZTE, as I would say it. Would that be a reality, even though actually many companies seem to be able to deliver to Huawei just fine by finding certain legal loopholes?
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this designation doesn't matter and that everybody's worked around it. The Huawei's projected fall in sales last week or 2 weeks ago was quite significant. I think this does matter. I don't think the workarounds are complete. I think the interesting question is whether President Xi will insist on some concession from President Trump on Huawei as his price for starting the negotiations. My gut is he hasn't, but I think that's certainly something to watch.
Let's talk about you wrote a very provocative piece this week. We often think of President Trump as being sort of the prime mover behind what people are calling deglobalization, the end of sort of free trade. You argue that Xi Jinping or China itself is just as much a contributor to this phenomenon, or maybe Xi Jinping is just as much of a contributor to this phenomenon as the U.S., and your evidence for it is China's falling share of imports relative to growth. So what's going on there?
If you look at China's imports of manufacturers over time and adjust for those imports which are clearly tied to China's exports, they've tended to fall as a share of China's GDP. If you look at U.S. manufacturing exports relative to China's GDP, in 2005, the U.S. was exporting about 2% of China's GDP in manufacturers to China. Now that's down to 1%. China, in general, China's demand for manufacturing imports has grown more slowly than China's economy. And I think you can tie that to some Chinese policies. It's no longer called Made in China 2025, but Made in China doesn't suggest globalization.
Right.
It suggests rather the opposite. China has wanted production for the Chinese market to be in China.
Well, they've wanted that, but how ready are they to do that? Because it seems like that when you look at the relationship with the U.S., they're either going to have to hasten that pretty quickly, or they're going to be left behind because they really don't have the capacity to do a lot of the things that they want to do.
It completely varies by product. So if you ask the following question, did China's post-crisis construction boom lead to a sustained increase in U.S. construction equipment exports to China? The answer is no. U.S. construction equipment exports to China peaked several years ago and are now below where they were in 2007. If you ask a different question, can China survive without importing any U.S. semiconductors right now? The answer there is also no.
Real quickly, where does this leave the rest of EM? For the many countries for whom either export to the U.S. for many years or export to China was crucial. If China is finding that it doesn't need to import as much, whether from the U.S. or anywhere else, U.S. is deglobalizing. What happens to essentially the business model of all these other countries whose markets and economies have been fairly unimpressive for years now?
To be clear, my argument that China is deglobalizing is limited to manufacturers.
Okay.
China's imports of commodities have grown, continue to grow. Global capacity has expanded, so it's no longer providing the same positive price impulse that drove emerging market commodity exporters during the boom. Clearly, Asian manufacturers face pressure. They certainly face pressure from China. They face pressure from China well before the trade tensions. Now there's an added risk that some of the adaptation that is going on in response to the tariffs could trigger a further U.S. response. Vietnam pretty clearly has been a winner, probably the only winner, out of the trade war. U.S. imports from Vietnam are soaring. But that's caught President Trump's eye, and he's now starting to criticize Vietnam.